But this week we are talking about the Old Saxon Genesis, and this is a little bit of an obscure topic, so I appreciate you guys tuning in. This was not something that we were so busy this weekend we didn't actually advertise, but it was something that we couldn't figure out how to advertise, because in a way it's, anyway, not very well known, but hopefully it's going to be a topic that you'll find as interesting as I do. So we are a fairly quotable quote or a well-known quote. It's better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. And I typed that into Google to kind of look at it. And essentially, like the first thing is like in some like answers.com or whatever, these kind of Ask Jeeves kind of thing. And the question that everybody was asking, where in the Bible does it say it's better to reign in heaven reign in hell than serve in heaven? And so where does it say that in the Bible? It does not say that in the Bible. So in fact, it comes from Milton, as Elizabeth was saying.
And that's Gustave Doré.
Gustave Doré's engraving, an illustration. So we'll quote here a little from Paradise Lost. So after there's a kind of a big, long vision of going through what the infernal realms are and how they're all connected to the world's horrible volcanoes and everything like that, Lucifer then asks, he's asking actually all his fallen angels that are around him, is this the region, this the soil, the clime? Said then the lost archangel, this the seat that we must change for heaven, this mournful gloom for that celestial light. Be it so, since he who now is sovereign can dispose and bid what shall be right. Farthest from him is best, whom reason hath equaled, for force hath made supreme above his equals. Farewell, happy fields. This is paradise being lost here, or actually paradise being lost for him as opposed to heaven being lost, as opposed to for the Adam and Eve, where joy forever dwells. So not in heaven anymore. Hail horrors, hail infernal world, and thou profoundest hell, receive thy new possessor, one who brings a mind not to be changed by place or time. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. What matter where, if I be still the same? So a philosophical reflection here from Lucifer, and so he was able to, now make heaven, this horrible location that he's in, he can maybe make it in his mind a heaven. And what I should be, all but less than he, whom thunder hath made greater, here at least we shall be free. The Almighty hath not built, here for his envy will not drive us hence. Here may we reign secure, and in my choice, to reign is worth ambition, though in hell. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. And so there's Lucifer's reflection upon having lost out anyway in his bid to take over heaven from God. So let's look at this. What?
12 books.
Does it say? Where does it say?
So it's 10.
Oh, yeah, 12 books. So it actually, I think it's in. There was two different editions. It should say 12 though in when it's done. So a epic poem in 12 books, over 10,000 lines of verse, composed by Milton, 17th century, retells then the story of humanity's fall, the temptation of Adam and Eve by Satan, and their expulsion from Eden. And it includes Satan as a major character and recounts his rebellion as the angel Lucifer in the war on heaven. And in fact actually puts a lot more quite thoughtful and philosophical reflection here into Lucifer's character in Paradise Lost. And so I've argued, we had before I think at the beginning of the year, we had a lecture called A Brief Biography of the Devil. And I argued in that in fact a lot of our imagery of the devil then comes not from the Bible, but actually from, especially from Milton, but from a lot of other much more recent sources and rewritings of this kind of text. And so this is a TV show. which I had not been aware. It's called Lucifer, and I hadn't been aware of this TV show until we did the brief biography of there's so much TV now that how can you be aware of what all the shows are? It used to be when there was only 3 networks when I was a little kid and PBS, that you all had seen all the same shows, and everybody knew what they all were, and we all could quote the same things. Now there's whole networks I've never heard of, obviously much less this. So you said you've seen it, Tim? Yeah, so Tim's seen it. And anyway, so this show is based on a graphic novel series by Neil Gaiman, who had this famous graphic novel series called Sandman, which is about these Eternals, including essentially death and dream and destiny and evil, essentially, so Lucifer. And so anyway, we have this idea of the devil as this compelling but let's say flawed character, that comes out of things like Milton and much more recently in all kinds of this culture. And I can say that my maternal grandfather told me once that he's a very literalistic believer in actually Mormonism. And he was walking one day on the streets of Billings, Montana, and he, met the devil right then and there. So it was a very, like this guy, good-looking guy, dressed kind of a European cut of his jib kind of thing. But my grandfather was very aware that was, who the devil was according to his understanding. So anyway, so it has percolated into the common culture. I think he just knew to steer clear, so he was able to. So I don't think he talked to him. So not from my recollection of the story. So what is actually the case, however, is Lucifer is not in the original Genesis. So as we're doing this kind of story of Adam and Eve and the fall of humanity in Paradise Lost, the whole Lucifer arc of this, the whole Adam and Eve part is a retelling of Genesis. The whole Lucifer part, however, is not from Genesis. So unlike Milton, which begins with this angelic rebellion, the Genesis story doesn't include any narration of a war in heaven. Genesis does include the story of the Garden of Eden, which takes place in Genesis chapter 2, verses 4b through chapter 3. But the characters in that are Yahweh, or God, the man, the woman. The woman at the end of the story is named Eve, and the serpent. There's a brief cameo of an angel with a flaming sword at the end to keep him out of Eden, but that's just it's like getting to be the tree in the play. So, okay, so here's a little bit of that. So talking about the serpent is one of the characters, very briefly actually mentioned, doesn't do too much in this, but the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God say, 'You shall not eat from any tree in the garden?' The woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.'" So that's the core serpent component in the story. So in the original here, the serpent is cited as a wild animal, not a devil. And in fact, when the story gets to its conclusion, when God is, dealing out the punishments to men, women, and serpents, he says to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you among all the animals, and among all wild creatures. Upon your belly shall you go, and the dust you shall eat all the days of your life." And so the Eden story, as we have it, is in fact an ideological myth, which is to say, how do we explain things like why don't snakes have legs, unlike all some sort of other vertebrate animals, right? And there's other things. Why do women have pain in childbirth? These sorts of, we have a natural effect, and these kind of stories are ways that you explain why those exist. Just so. And so one of the other idea I argue is also a fable, because fables are essentially stories that have talking animals. is generally how it's defined. And so there are two of these just only that have made it into the Pentateuch. In general, probably the biblical redactor who edited all the source texts and put it all in was probably dubious of talking animal stories, and mostly they didn't make the cut. The other one is kind of famously the story of Balaam's ass, is what it's called. And so I don't know if you remember it, but essentially this is a story where the prophet is riding along on the donkey, and the donkey sees an invisible angel with a flaming sword and won't go forward because of the danger. And the Balaam keeps on, whipping the donkey in order to. And the donkey's mouth is opened, and he says, "What are you beating me for?" This kind of a thing. So, if we go to the documentary hypothesis, so the main, we've had a couple lectures on this before too, but essentially the main literary critical way that scholars argue that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, are put together. It suggests that both of these fables are coming from the J source, or the Yahweh source, and that source is probably written maybe in the 7th century before the Common Era. That's a whole big long, we have to have a whole lecture on that to argue that, but we'll just say that for this. So, to my thinking, if then we take that author, or the whole author of the Pentateuch, altogether, if they had meant the serpent to represent the devil, one would expect that character to recur in the text. So we had very explicitly in the text that we're talking about wild animals. A particular wild animal gets punished, as opposed to God coming and identifying this as his rival, this person this angel that he'd cast out or something like that, and who he then rebukes again or something like that. That doesn't happen. And what also doesn't happen is that no cosmic Lucifer character or the devil then continues to recur at all the bad moments when people are tempted. In the Exodus, it doesn't say that Satan appeared and hardened Pharaoh's heart, that Pharaoh would not let the people go. It actually says the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, that he would not let the people go. And same thing, for example, in the Cain and Abel story, which is part of the Yahweh's text, the J source, the next story, it doesn't happen that this same kind of recurring cosmic devil character shows up and is what tempts Cain to slay his brother. That simply is absent in the text. So there's no real further mentions of a cosmic of a serpent character, and the cosmic devil is not really a concept that exists then in First Temple Judaism, which is to say the developmental stage up into the destruction of Solomon's temple in 586 BCE.
John, could you just quickly, in 1 minute, remind us of the sources? So I have people online asking what the J source is.
So essentially we're talking about the documentary hypothesis, and so essentially what's happened is that all of these texts are so ancient that we don't have their component. We can only look at the texts as they were compiled together in the Second Temple period. So we have essentially the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And so what scholars have noticed then in taking those, they have to work with now is literary criticism. And so you can pick them apart and say, boy, you're reading right along here, and then the tone of voice, the entire writing style just suddenly changes, and it goes like that for a little while, and then it changes back to the original one, and then it recurs. And so interwoven are essentially different authors that have actually very distinct styles. And so these are generally called J, E, P, and D, and that refers to J for Jehovah, the Yahweh source. So this is a person who is interested in the Judean monarchy, so it's written in the southern of the 2 kingdoms, and it's primarily a courtly source, so it's not highly religious, it's not priestly. The E source, the Elohist, and so this is the source that reflects the traditions of the northern kingdom, Israel, as opposed to Judea, and it is probably written by one of the exiles that has come down now and is part of the Judean kingdom. the P source. This is a priestly source, and so this is the one that makes the whole Bible so boring. So, and there's good things too. The whole cosmic creation in Genesis 1, let there be light, when God says that, that's coming out of the priestly source, but the other parts of it are just like unending rituals about what's being done in the Jerusalem temple and things like that. And so it's essentially written by someone who is an Aaronid priest, one of the Sadducees. And then finally the Deuteronomist. The Deuteronomist primarily just writes the book of Deuteronomy. So it's a separate author than the rest.
And you cover that in the who wrote Genesis, right?
Yeah, we had several lectures where we talk about it, and so we'll do it again. So the Q source is another one we talk about, and Q is for the Gospels. So this is the first, what we just talked about is the documentary hypothesis, essentially how you use literary criticism to pull out the source texts of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and then Q is a source that the authors of 2 of the Gospels, Matthew and Luke, had. When they are composing their Gospels, literary criticism tells us that the most likely scenario is that they had access to the Gospel of Mark, and they had access to this lost gospel called Q. And they used both of them to put together to make their Gospels, which is why then Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so similar, but they're different. So anyway, essentially these are the tools that you have to work with literary criticism as you kind of are essentially looking for the seams through which these kind of books are put together. And this was a good little diversion or digression to have, because actually it's kind of critical to the story also of the Old Saxon Genesis, this use of literary criticism. So I thank the people online for asking about it. Oh, the people at Barry. Okay, so also I mentioned here there's no cosmic devil in the Hebrew Bible. We've had that before in our biography of the Bible lecture. And there's also no war in heaven story in the Hebrew Bible. It does exist, however, in the Christian New Testament. So, already though, then, by the Second Temple period, and then especially the end of the Second Temple period when Jesus is around and the beginnings of Christianity, already the idea of the cosmic devil has been introduced into Judaism. Probably we've seen before from Zoroastrianism. And by this time, then, by the time of Jesus, the serpent in the Eden story has definitely been reinterpreted as an incarnation of this cosmic Satan, right? So the early Christians definitely felt that way. So for example, in the book of Revelation, the very last book of the Christian New Testament, John the Revelator speaks of, quote, the dragon, that old serpent, who is the devil, Satan. So all at once then he's pieced together what had been completely separate characters or individual references in the Hebrew Bible, and now he said just by putting them as different names, he's glommed them all together into being the same guy. And so that explicitly equates the old serpent, the Bible from the Eden story, with the cosmic devil. And you can see that works its way into the artwork, right? And so there's a serpent who you can also tell is also secretly a fallen angel, Lucifer, right?
Female.
Oh, is that a female one?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's good.
In the artwork in Italy, sometimes some of the artists depict the serpent as having the same appearance as Eve, because they say that the snake, in order to charm Eve, would have had to not look like a snake.
Okay.
So it would have reflected her own image back on her, just like how Gabriel often mimics poses of Mary.
Okay.
Kind of like they're in contrapose or
Gotcha.
that sort of thing. So the top of the snake is actually supposed to be a reflection of Eve.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I hadn't seen that, but it's a late image, and so I wasn't aware of that, of why that would work that way. I can give that back to. Thanks. Cool.
I wouldn't even know what she looks like.
They have reflecting holes in them.
Yes, I didn't even.
In fact, we'll read when we get to the Old Saxon Genesis, the serpent actually has what's essentially from a Germanic mythology. It's not actually the devil; it's in one of the other fallen angels, one of the devil's thanes, and the Thane has essentially like a weirding helm, and so he can put this helm on that allows him to take different shapes and forms. And so in the Old Saxon Genesis, it appears to Eve as this glorious angel in all kinds of regalia and armor and everything like that, but Adam just sees a snake. And so as a result of that, there is this different ideas about how this kind of this later interpretations of how the story is. So why we see sometimes we have, in other words, they're trying to explain why this serpent, who is clearly what they're talking about in the Yahweh source in the original author of Genesis, has now, since we now have reinterpreted that to be a fallen angel of some type, how could they have been so confused, right? Okay, so the war in heaven story, as we have it in general, especially takes its source from the book of Revelation. So we have, for example, people may be aware that the story of the Trojan horse isn't actually in the Iliad. So the war in heaven isn't part of Genesis, but unlike the Trojan horse, where the story is actually ancient, it's actually also mentioned in the Odyssey, even though it's not fully told there. The war in heaven narrative is actually a much later addition to the Christian creation story, maybe 7 or 8 centuries after the Eden story. So we can read a little bit of this from the book of Revelation. This is Revelation chapter 12. A great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and her head was a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and crying out in birth pangs, the agony of giving birth. These are wonderful illustrations from the Beatus, from Spanish, medieval Spanish illumination. They always look great. They're like 1,000 years before Picasso's, whenever you have them. Then another portent appeared in heaven, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his head. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to earth. And so that is generally how that's interpreted. This is where this war of heaven, 1/3 of the stars, 1/3 of the angels rebel with Satan, as that's how that's often interpreted anyway. Then the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child, so that he might devour her child as soon as it was born. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all nations with a rod of iron. But her child was snatched away and taken to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, so that she can be nourished for 1,260 days. So one of the wonderful numbers that once you get into apocalyptic literature, then everybody wants to start doing calculations and all this kind of thing. Okay. And a war broke out in heaven. Michael, the archangel, and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated, and there was no longer a place for them in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Okay, so we have had a lecture before on the book of Revelation too, and how essentially the modern interpretation that we get from people in like the Left Behind series and things like that, how this has grown out of essentially 12th century medieval way of interpreting the text that was popularized by a medieval monk named Joachim of Fiora, and so essentially he read into the text all sorts of stuff happening in the 12th century. So as you're reading like all of the different signs of the times and all of the different antichrists that are appearing, Saladin is one of them, because he was a medieval Christian monk, and a mystic, And so anyway, so as it updated for his time, all his calculations, indicated that, that the end of the world was going to happen within about 13 years of his life as he figured that all out. Obviously, that didn't work out, and so then they continuously then have updated every decade or so, frankly, all the way up to now, and so people aren't even aware that they're in this this long process of continually doing the calculations, deciding that the whole thing is going to happen either this year or within the next 5 to 10 years. and then declaring that based on your own math, and reading all the signs and all the people as your own contemporary figures. So obviously, depending on, your mindset, Donald Trump, or more likely Obama, given the mindset, was the sign of the end, or any number of things. The UN Secretary General is the Antichrist, or however anybody wants to particularly do that, right? But essentially, then the year comes, and that calculation didn't work, and so this misreading essentially is about 1,000-year-old misreading of the text. Okay, let's look at the real text. So it's written by a Christian named John, who is not the apostle of the same name, or either of the apostles of the same name, and he's not the author of the gospel that is attributed to John, nor of any of the letters that are attributed to John's. And he's a guy who you can tell because his Greek is so distinct. So this particular author who wrote Revelation writes he's got a very vivid imagery, but he also, he's a vivid visionary, with all kinds of imagery. That's one of the reasons why we have all this great medieval Spanish stuff that, like I say, looks like Picasso. Actually, we have, Albrecht Dürer has all these amazing things. It's been an inspiration to all kinds of Christian artwork for 2,000 years. But he also has a real slang-happy Greek where it's not, where he's almost like street Greek or rap Greek, or something like that. So it is not, and it's not grammatical often and all this kind of thing. And so it's quite different from the Greek of the Gospel of John or the epistles of John. Okay, it's frequently misinterpreted, as I say, as a guide to the future, beginning in the 12th century especially. But as always is the case, when somebody's writing a text like this, they're actually referring to their own times. So the prophets are always looking at signs, and they are thinking about what's going on right now. And if their role is frankly to talk to people in the now, with their vision of hopefully maybe averting whatever they see as a problematic thing for the future, of course, a wrong course. And so, for example, a good thing to be a prophet about right now, for example, is climate change. And we can all be prophets about that. And the idea of it is to get us all to be aware of the magnitude of this problem and how we need to address it right now, so that we can minimize, we can't avert anymore, so we can minimize the horrific effects that are coming, right? So the offense of his own days that John is referring to especially is the persecution of early Christian churches, his early Christian communities, specifically the ones that he's writing his book to as a letter, so the ones essentially in what's now Turkey. There's 7 churches that he's specifically writing to, and he has particular complaints to them. And so that's clear in the beginning of the book. Okay, so we'll try to do this uncontentiously. There's a lot of people want to interpret all of these things, but I'm going to try to say that there's some fairly straightforward interpretation usually. So the male child, I think, destined to rule all nations, but snatched away to God's throne, I think is clearly, John means that to me, Jesus. So Christ, he's snatched away, killed, and but is raised up and goes to God's throne. The woman with the crown of 12 stars. So essentially this, it's like the Christian interpretation of a new Israel, or holy Israel is a Christian Israel as who flees into the wilderness to escape the dragon. It's generally interpreted now as Mary, but probably at this time what it should be is the Christian church itself, essentially the churches to whom John is writing, who are facing this persecution by Roman imperial officials at the time that John is writing. And so essentially, why? So because he's really worrying about this particular episode, and that's who he's writing to. So that's why I think that image, this is the more contentious interpretation that we might have, but anyway, is referring to that. The dragon then is explicitly equated here with this cosmic devil, but we also see that he has 7 heads and 7 diadems, and so that's reflecting John's view that he has all through the text, that the empire of Rome, with her 7 hills very famously, so Rome of 7 hills, so 7 heads, 7 crowns, is the satanic counterfeit, of the empire of God preached by Jesus. So when Jesus will say things like, the kingdom of heaven is like, or the kingdom of God is like, the word kingdom that he uses in Greek is the same word as Greeks use for the Roman Empire, right? And so the Roman Empire of God is like this, as opposed to the counterfeit empire that the Romans are claiming is an empire, the Pax Romana of eternal empire of peace, eternal Rome and an empire of peace, because what John and other Christians are arguing at this stage is that that empire is built on violence. So the fact that it's, which it was, yeah, and violence. And so because it's at sword point of the legions, it's not. It's therefore a tyranny as far as John and his contemporaries in early Christianity are concerned, as opposed to what the true and just and peaceable empire of God would be about. Okay, so John, like I say, is speaking for his own day, and so when this vision is happening, so we can see if this idea of the woman and her child, the child being Jesus. The war in heaven breaks out after Jesus is born and also resurrected, right? According to this vision. And so as a result of that, this war in heaven of Satan getting cast out of heaven is not meant to be retrojected back into the primeval past of Genesis, but rather it's John understanding what's happening in his own day. So in other words, this we have in the book of Job one of the mentions in the Old Testament of a character called Satan, and Satan has a place in the court of heaven. And so it's not. So what John is essentially saying here is that that's no longer the case now that we're here in this Christian era. And so now the reason why we're seeing all of this horror of the contemporary world that he is very aware of for him is because Satan has been cast out and all of his angels, and they are stirring up trouble now, now that we're in this new Christian era. And so likewise, although when people are misreading the apocalypse as a far, far future text, as if John was looking forward 2,000 years to now, or if we lived 400 years ago, 1,600 years till then, whenever, or if we lived 400 years from now, 2,400 years till then, as opposed to reading it that way, what he also is essentially saying here is it's not a time in the future when the four horsemen of the apocalypse are going to be loosed, where we're suddenly going to have in the world pestilence, war, famine, and death. We already have, in the world, and they already had back then, pestilence, war, famine, and death. The idea here is that the four horsemen are with us and among us, and what John is foreseeing in the part of the apocalypse that we don't usually look at is a time when there will be past that era. In other words, where there will be established a peaceable and just Roman Empire, or whatever, kingdom of heaven on earth is what his hope is, and that's when death and war and famine and pestilence will be extinguished and they won't be with us anymore. Okay, so with that background, to try to look at what the biblical part of it was, let's look at Anglo-Saxon literature then, and this interesting text, the Old Saxon Genesis. This is actually an illustration. It's one of the neat things about this, as opposed to some of the things where we are doing lectures, I have to kind of pull images from all over the place. In this case, the particular manuscript of Genesis B, the Anglo-Saxonized version of the Old Saxon Genesis, is actually partially illustrated, and so we'll have a lot of these images that are from that. And so we don't have here the serpent in this particular illustration anyway looking like Eve, so in the 10th century. Okay, just to briefly cover who the Anglo-Saxons are. So they are essentially the 5th century colonizers of Britain who are coming from the barbarian realms, as the Romans thought of it, of what's now Denmark and Germany and the Netherlands, the lowlands. And the exact locations aren't entirely known of what they happened, but essentially the idea is that there's, according to Bede anyway, Anglo-Saxons and Jutes. Jutes get left out often, but the Jutes go essentially to Kent and also maybe to Isle of Wight or Anglesey, anyway, down in the islands down there. The Angles go across to the northern part here, and the Saxons more around here. And essentially, what they come for initially, apparently, is as mercenaries. They essentially, the Roman legions have left, and they're there to. They're also pirates, but they're also defending against pirates and other kinds of raids. But then it didn't take very long till they realized, well, wait a second, we could just start owning the place. And that's sort of what was happening all around in the Western Roman Empire as all of the different Germanic confederations were taking over from the activities of what had been taken on by the Roman central government and the Roman military. This is not a case, though, as people sometimes imagined, of like some kind of wholesale extermination where all of the Romano-British people were just wiped out or something, and a whole new, or pushed only into Wales. There were a whole bunch of people that are staying there where there's not very heavy colonization, but essentially it's fairly light colonization, and so the genetic tests of all of this is that there's a very big mix in Britain of all of this kind of stuff. There's a lot of maintenance of Romano-British people. And so the word Anglo-Saxon, although it was much misused in the 19th and 20th centuries, it never referred to like a race. It's not a race. It's actually a bunch of different people, Anglo-Saxons, Jutes, Frisians, who are Germanic peoples, but in relatively small numbers, crossing and immediately intermarrying with Romano-British people that are already there. And what ended up happening largely is that most of the Romano-British people then adopted Saxon customs and language. Shaheen.
Yeah, I was just going to say with respect to the Anglo-Saxons marrying Britons and Britons taking on Anglo-Saxon culture, if it was a sort of like an equal sharing thing, then wouldn't we see more Celtic influences on the English language, and we barely see any of those? So that to me implies a sort of a top-down imposition.
Yes. Yeah, I wouldn't call this an equal sharing. But the question was whether it's a wholesale extermination and replacement. And that's what people, I think, were often taught even in the middle of the 20th century, that there's and this is like this idea of this Anglo-Saxon racial ideology and things like that. That's what I'm kind of arguing against. It is a situation where there's obviously a real cultural collapse that happened in Roman Britain because so much of everything, people just went over to all of the different Anglo and Saxon traditions, language, naming, all these kind of conventions. One of the things that's different strange things happen when your society is collapsing. And so kind of oddly, simultaneously what's happening in France, in Gaul, is that a place that had been, let's say, largely still Celtic pagan and Celtic speaking, and now it gets conquered by Germanic speaking barbarians. Nevertheless, suddenly everybody now starts speaking Latin and being Christian. and so it's kind of a weird thing that because they had gotten to a little bit of over the cusp, that they can't be mixed up and have all of the different under, the peasant society and under, that undergirding society somehow wasn't able to survive. And this is now when essentially the Druids and Celtic language and everything like that, mostly, except for Brittany, which is actually because of the Britons actually go down there, mostly gets beaten out of the people in Gaul, and they mostly become kind of Roman. And in fact, even then their conquerors, the Franks, we think, well, wait a second, if Franks are all speaking German, why is French primarily a Romance language? And it's because in this case then the conquerors themselves then all started speaking the language. So the cultural institutions there were stronger. But the collapse happened the other way here. And so it can kind of happen either way. I mean, the same strange, weird thing happens in southern Italy, where suddenly everybody starts speaking Greek a lot more. So anyway, when the kind of fall happens, and so it's not always what you'd expect. A lot of times you think the conqueror comes in and you're all going to start speaking that language, but it doesn't always work that way. It does work that way here in England. So initially, also they all, since the Anglos and Saxons are all pagans. Initially, the Christian Britain becomes pagan, Anglo-Saxon, Germanic pagan. But slowly, from both a mission that the Pope directly sends to Kent. And the Kent, which is one of these, the Jute Kingdom here. So we can see these different kingdoms: Kent, Sussex, Essex, Wessex, East Anglia, Mercia, Northumbria. Those are the classic ones. There's a bunch of other little ones. So Kent, its capital was Canterbury. And so that's why then, because they convert, the archbishopric gets put in Canterbury. Meanwhile, the Irish are also Christian, and they busily converting everybody from the other side. And so it doesn't take too long, and they all convert to Christianity. We'll talk about that, and we're having a lecture. Why did all the pagans lose out? In about 3 weeks.
It's interesting that Cornwall is on the map is called West Wales because, of course, it's another Celtic language.
Yes.
And related to Welsh.
Yes. Corn Welsh, as it's sometimes called, or whatever. But is like they get cut off because of the West Saxons, and so essentially they're cut off from the rest of the people that are in Wales. And Glaswegians here is also a different British people, as are there's Picts, and then when the people who we think of as Scots, Scot is at this time period means Irish, and so it's confusing. But essentially, the Scots are in the Irish invading from, the old Scotland, which is Ireland, but anyway, to the new realm of the Scots. And so Scotland also is a big mixture, but it doesn't happen until much later in the Middle Ages. Yeah, there's Picts up here, which are again a kind of a British people they're all Celtic peoples, but they have different their languages are further apart, right? So it's like difference between there's different Germanic languages which are Indo-European, and those are quite different than from Celtic languages that are Indo-European. Okay, so when this all happened, even though there is this sort of barbarian invasion and that kind of thing and fall of Rome, nevertheless, there is in the British Isles still kind of a retention of more of classical culture at different times in what people think of as the Dark Ages than in some places that's happening. For example, in Gaul, where the Merovingian period is some pretty dark times in terms of scholarship. And so scholars like the Venerable Bede kept Latin learning alive in the 700s. And his school, so he's up in Northumbria, his school produced a guy, Alcuin of York, or not his, but anyway, that same training that's going on up there in Northumbria, to go to his court as Charlemagne is trying to gather all of the best scholars from all around Europe. And Alcuin becomes one of the leading scholars of what becomes the Carolingian Renaissance in the 780s and 790s. That gets then re-injected back into Britain after kind of another fall of some of the educational system, and a guy, Alfred the Great, who's great for all kinds of different reasons. He's the leader of what ends up being the last of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms when the Danes attack and conquer all the other ones. He also is an amazing scholar of Latin, and he does all of his own translations and things like that. And one of the things that he does is promote education throughout the remaining kingdom, including a program of getting people, including lay people, to learn in Anglo-Saxon. And so he gets lots of books getting copied and things like that, and establishes schools. And so as a result, there is a pretty serious flowering of Anglo-Saxon literature in the Anglo-Saxon period.
Can you read that?
I cannot. You have to have a lot of, it's Latin, yeah. This is not, so what it says, incipit Evangelii e genealogia Matthew. So, and then this is however Matthew starts, but that's complicated. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, the last bit looks Greek, the bottom line.
Yeah, but yeah, well, it's weird though, right? Why would anyway? So I'm not sure, but this is one of these Anglo-Saxon Gospels from Northumbria. Okay, fast forward. So the Norman Conquest, 1066. Old English, Anglo-Saxon fell out of use in the following centuries. Norman French became the language of the court. Latin is the language of the church. The spoken language of everyday use evolved from Old English into Middle English into eventually Elizabethan English. The manuscripts of the Old English or Anglo-Saxon remained in the monasteries, but then Henry VIII got rid of the monasteries, and so in the 16th century here, 1536 to 41, they get looted. Henry essentially is interested in making fast cash for himself and his friends. He gives a lot of them off to his friends. They just cart all the books out of libraries and everything like that. And so unfortunately, only 4 major Anglo-Saxon codices survived that devastation, which is very sad. So the 4 that we have are the Beowulf manuscript, which includes Beowulf itself, the most famous work of the Anglo-Saxon literature, and a bunch of other prose works, a lot of which thematically relate to the theme of monsters. And so it's sometimes called a book of monsters, this whole overall grouping. The Exeter book, which has a bunch of poems, including all of these riddles, if you're familiar with Anglo-Saxon riddles. There's a book called the Vercelli book, which has all kinds of other poems in it that for some reason made its way to Vercelli, Italy, and it's not clear why. Vercelli, Italy also has one of the surviving English Mappa Mundi. And so, if you're aware of the Hereford Mappa Mundi, which is the largest surviving of these, and it's an English one, and there's several other, it's a big English tradition. For some reason, somebody carted one of them off to Vercelli, and they've got one. So anyway, the Vercelli map. And then finally, the Junius Manuscript, which is the one that includes the Anglo-Saxon, or Genesis B, as we'll talk about it. So this is a sample of the riddles. If you're aware of how these Anglo-Saxon riddles go, and you kind of see how Anglo-Saxon poetry works, there's usually this caesura in the middle of the line. These are translated, obviously, because I don't speak Old English or Anglo-Saxon. So a warrior is wondrously brought into the world for the use of lords by 2 dumb things. Rightly extracted, which for his hurt, foe bears against foe. Strong though he is, a woman binds him. He obeys them well, serves them quietly. If maids and men tend him, duly feed him fairly. He exalts them in comfort, for their joy in life grimly rewards one who lets him grow proud. So, what is that? Elizabeth doesn't know what the riddle is. So what is this referring to?
2 dumb things.
2 dumb things. If you rub them together, they will bring this to this warrior into being. When you do that, yeah, fire, right? So even though he's a strong warrior, he can be used, brought into the world. A woman can bind him. So in other words, women can use him and use him for serving them. If the fire is tended properly, it'll exalt the people in their comfort and life. But you don't want him to grow too proud, right? So it'll be grimly rewarded if you let it get too proud, because it'll burn your house down, right? So anyway, they're like that, right? And so you might be familiar with these from The Hobbit, right? Because J.R.R. Tolkien, who is a linguist and a great scholar of Anglo-Saxon, had The Hobbit say all of these in The Hobbit, and also Gollum in their little riddle war. Say all of essentially these Anglo-Saxon riddles where, does anybody know how to quote one of them? I'm trying to think of the one that's like these things. I mean, it's the one of them that Gollum has that's so grim, is that essentially these things, all things, lay low, and it's essentially time, right? So time is going to ultimately kill everything, and then Bilbo responds, "What have I got in my pocket?" Which is not a riddle, right? So anyway, but this is essentially the kind of thing that Anglo-Saxons loved. So they love this kind of riddle. So, okay, so the Junius Manuscript. This is the one that we're concerned with, as opposed to the one with the riddles. So this is one of those 4 surviving ones. It's named for its 17th century owner. This is an Anglo-Dutch scholar named Franciscus Junius, who is John Milton's friend and contemporary, actually. So the manuscript contains 4 biblically inspired Anglo-Saxon poems. The poems actually, turns out, are groupings of other poems. So the 4th one here, on Christ confronting Satan, is actually 3 different poems about Christ that have been stuck together. But the first one is Genesis, or a retelling of Genesis. The second one is a retelling of Exodus. And the third one is a retelling of Daniel. Okay, so we had talked about earlier when we were talking about the documentary hypothesis, and also when we were talking about Q, we talked about how literary critics are able to look through, and they're looking at word choice, they're looking at vocabulary, they're looking at the era of which, like how the text goes. And between that, you can start to see sometimes very obvious seams, or sometimes another way that you can do literary criticism is by finding anachronisms. So part of the text is clearly written much later than other parts of the text. And so using these disciplines, a scholar named Edward Sievers determined in the 1870s that lines 235 to 871 of the Anglo-Saxon Genesis poem in this manuscript are actually an interpolation from what then for him was a hypothetical poem composed in Old Saxon that had been lost, which he called Genesis B. So he said the rest of the poem that frames it is Genesis A, and then he took this little part of it out and said this is a different poem, Genesis B, and he could say, and he made the argument that for these and those reasons, this is not written directly in Anglo-Saxon, but somebody is Anglo-Saxonizing an Old Saxon poem. So somebody who had already got a hold of something that was already composed in a slightly different language, Old Saxon. And so this was a theoretical lost hypothetical source like Q that we talked about, or J, E, and P. In other words, these are all hypothetical sources that we don't have. They are the best explanation for why the Synoptic Gospels are the way they are, why the Pentateuch is the way it is, but we don't have them separately as their own sources to prove that that's the case. In this case, however, which we may never find those. In this case, shortly thereafter, his hypothesis was proved, when in 1894, fragments of the 19th century Old Saxon poem were found in a manuscript in the Vatican. So we were able to then tell that there is this poem. We don't have the whole thing. We only have the part, more or less, there's a couple fragments, and then we have the part that has been excerpted and made into the Anglo-Saxonized version, the Genesis B. So then Genesis B is the 10th century Anglo-Saxonized interpolation of that original Old Saxon Genesis poem. Is that kind of clear? So, but the neat thing about this is that this is one of these triumphs of this hypothetical literary criticism. So we talk about this a fair amount because it's so common with ancient and medieval texts for people to take existing texts. When you had to make a text, every single time you make it, you have to write it out. As long as you're making a copy anyway, it is actually quite reasonable that somebody who's, let's say, taken notes on that manuscript, that they'll now combine those notes when they're making the copy into a new text. And so the text will get longer, or you might add 2 or 3 books that are all this about Jesus fighting the devil together into one, And so this was a kind of a common thing that is happening, but it's harder when all we have is the combined things to argue to people, and we make the case, this really is 3 different books and they have 3 different authors, but in order to understand them, we have to understand the authors, right? And so having one of these, an example, for example, where it really was proved, ends up being a neat thing. So Genesis B then is that 10th century, so we said that. Okay, so let's look at it. I'm going to read a bunch of this because I kind of think that what you get the impression, unlike if you're familiar anyway with how the Bible kind of goes, there's a lot of ways this poem, even though translated into contemporary English, you still get a sense of it as an Old Saxon or a Germanic kind of war poem like Beowulf. So the all-wielder, you're already getting into these epic ways of describing, in this case, God with an ornamental epithet. The all-wielder had of angel kind through handiwork, Holy Lord, 10 types trimmed. So he's the all-wielder has made all the different kinds of angels. He trusted them well. Them he trusted well, knew that his rule were designed to follow, to work his will, because he gave them wit. So God created the angels to follow his rules. And with his hands shaped them, Holy Lord. He had set them up so blessedly. One in particular he had created so shining, so mighty in his thinking. He let him wield so much power, highest next to him in heaven kingdom. He had him so brightly created, so winsome were his ways in heaven, that came to him from the Lord's company, that he was like the light of the stars. And all of these angel illustrations are from the actual manuscript. He should have loved the work of the Lord. He should have held dear to himself in his joys in heaven, and should have thanked his Lord for those delights that he shared with him in that light. Then God would have permitted him, this angel, for a long time to wield power. But he, that angel, turned himself to a terrible thing. He began to heave up trouble against him, God, against that highest heaven's ruler who sits on the saintly throne. Dear was he to our Lord, yet God might not be deluded, that his angel began to become overspirited. He raised himself up against his superior, sought hate speech, boast words began. He did not wish to serve God. He said that his body was light and shining, bright white and hue luminous. You can just see, all of these kind of ways. I don't know, you can think of how Beowulf, like all of the different, his armor is described, these kind of, anyway.
That's what Meredith Grey says to Christina Yang in Grey's Anatomy, that they're bright and shiny.
Oh, bright and shiny, there you go.
They're not bright and shiny.
Nor might he find in his mind that he owed God the duty of an inferior. So you're going to get to this. This is so dear to this kind of warrior culture, if you can imagine, of the Anglo-Saxons and also the Old Saxons, to their heart, as they're understanding this idea of, let's say, your great king, but then you have these overmighty thanes. And at a certain point, you're supposed to always, as a loyal thane, you're always supposed to be loyal to your liege lord, right? But at a certain point, you're so high and all this kind of thing, you say certain things in your pride and that kind of a thing. And so then you think to yourself, well, why shouldn't I be the king? Why should I be an inferior? I shouldn't have to serve as a retainer. So in other words, one of these people, and you can just see that this imagery was made a lot of sense to the kind of Anglo-Saxon courts that this would have been read in. He thought to himself that he had more strategy and strength than the holy God could have in his followers. Dangerous words spoke this angel in his adrenaline rush. He thought about how, through his own efforts, a strong-built throne could establish higher in heaven. And it's like even like building like this great hall, right, in Harrod Hall to bring people to. Strong-built throne could he establish higher in heaven. He said that his mind spanned so far that he, west and north, was beginning to work trimming timbers.
They actually translated the word adrenaline?
Yeah, I confess to some curiosity about
do.
the original, which
I
is
did too.
translated adrenaline.
I did too. I don't. I think that that's one of these cases where I don't see no Anglo-Saxon, so I wasn't able to go back. That one stuck out to me too.
John, what was the question, please?
The question was, do we think that adrenaline was in the original? And as we talked about in our lecture last week, medieval people had a very different theory of internal medicine, and so probably what exists here is it's probably about the humors, and so it's probably the original is probably talking about being caloric, but because that wouldn't make sense to a lot of us right now. This has been translated, even Alfred the Great says, sometimes he translated word for word, sometimes sense for sense. And so this is sense for sense, so that we can understand what it means.
And it's alliterated.
Yeah, so it's also poetry, right? And so this is also, what I'm preserving here is it's too long, the lines are too long in modern English to fit on here, so I put the caesura line, there's this pause in the line, and I put it on the next line there. So yeah, alliteration is one of the ways that Anglo-Saxon poetry works, so the translator here has done a good job of adding Okay. So this is Satan still. Lucifer, this angel, he said that he thought it quite doubtful that he would become the retainer of God. What will I gain, said he. There is no need for me to have a leader. I may within my own hands a multitude of wonders work. I have great capacity to adorn a godlike throne, more impressive in heaven. Why shall I follow in the wake of his perfection? His protection. Shove at him such subservience. I may be God as well as he. Strong supporters stand beside me, who will not betray me in the strife. Hard-minded companions. They have crowned me as their superior, the renowned ringmen. With such may one take counsel. I mean, again, these ringmen, this is essentially, we're talking about all of Satan's thanes, right? All of Lucifer's men in the battle, like Beowulf's men. Seize the prize with a standing army like this. They are my eager friends, loyal to the death in their forged intentions. I may become their high king, rule in this kingdom. I think it is so right for me that I bother to flatter not a whit more God for the sake of any good. He's not going to be a flatterer anymore. He's not a retainer. He should be king. Nor will I long be his retainer, he says. So I quoted that as a long excerpt here, but I think that you can kind of see how a story, how far the story is actually away from the biblical original, as we also quoted and read them, but why this would have had like a lot of resonance, as people are trying to Christianize first Old Saxons and also Anglo-Saxons. That they are interested in, like, essentially they could be told these same Bible stories now, but they're being told them in a way that makes all the sense in the world to them. So this kind of issues that all the rest of their literature is about, which is, things like what happens when you have conflicts of loyalty in terms of your oaths, what happens, any number of kinds of things between fights that occur between lords and liegemen and this kind of thing. Okay, so, as this illustration from the Junius Manuscript goes, of the war in heaven and Michael and everybody casting down all of the fallen angels into the pit, which is a very literally drawn as a big mouth. Things don't go as planned for all of these rebellious angel thanes or retainers who were cast into hell and take on the form of devils. So the transformation is also kind of narrated here. So after they're now kicked out, after they've now found themselves in this new realm, this new hell, Satan now addresses his ringmen, his thanes, and he essentially comes up with a new plan. Since obviously they're not going to overthrow God, they're not going to establish their own kingdom anymore, because God actually figured that out pretty fast. God's omnipotent and omniscient. And so he kicked them out right away before they actually did anything. So God has now marked out, this is what Satan says, God has now marked out one Middle Earth where he has created humans after his own likeness. With them, he will afterwards populate the land of heaven with pure souls. So once the humans have gone through their lives, if they are pure souls, they're going to go be now in heaven, this heaven that Satan and that Lucifer, he's now Satan, and the fallen angels have gotten kicked out of. They're going to take that land, heaven land. We should avidly think upon this, how we in Adam, if we ever may, and in some of his posterity too, enclose terror. So Adam and his posterity, what can we do with those guys? Deprive him there of those joys of theirs, if we might think of anything. I desire no longer that light that he thinks him long to enjoy. So I'm not going to be able to be in this heaven anymore. We get it. We aren't going to be able to have that. But we now see Adam thinking that he's going to get to have this eternal place in heaven. Those joys that he thinks to enjoy, those joys with his angel knowledge. Nor may we overcome the fire or weaken the resolution of mighty God. There's nothing they can do. They realize this fight with God isn't going to change anything. Let us go, wrench it away from the children of men, that heaven land, now that we cannot have it. So all of these humans that are destined to be able to be in heaven land and have this thing, that's the one place that there's a weakness here that Satan is seeing. So let's go wrench that away from the children of men, now that we cannot have it. Make it so that they betray their duty, that they undo what God, with his word, ordered. Then he, God, will become wrathful in spirit, exile them from his loyal band. Then they shall seek this hell and these grim grounds. Then we will have them as our servants, those progeny suffering in this vast prison. So they're going to get some consolation here. They're going to be able to thwart God's new plan by not letting God have all these humans be, pure souls in heaven. And two, there's this inheritance thing. This is their land. Heaven is was their territory, and so they do not want new people, usurpers, to come and take that inheritance from them. They can instead get them to come to the new land, hell, to be servants in the prison. Begin now to think about that campaign, Lucifer tells his angels. If I ever before gave any thane treasures, when we were in that good kingdom, were blessedly seated and had autonomy in our assembly. If I'd ever been a great lord that was giving out rings and treasure and everything like that, the way Anglo-Saxon kings do, then he, this thane who got the rings and stuff from me back then, never at a better time might compensate me. Now is payback time, folks. We now need to do this. Repay my gifts. If any one of my thanes, moreover, desires to give his consent, he up from here might come through these gates and have craft within him, so that he might with feathered limbs might fly, wind through the firmament, to where stand created Adam and Eve in earth kingdom, be wound with joys, while we be warped hither in this deep dale. Now they are to the Lord worth much, and they might gain that inheritance that we should have in heavenland, our kingdom by right. That bequest is granted to humankind. That is in my mind so distressing, harrowing to my spirit, that they, heaven kingdom, should gain as inheritance. So this is also one of these things that is so moving to, like these Anglo-Saxon lords, is this idea that if you're ever kind of disinherited from essentially your ancestral lands, then you go off and live in exile and all this kind of thing. And very frequently, if the noble house doesn't die out, within a generation or so, they will actually get it back often. And so they'll, because the people were very persistent in that kind of goal. And so it would quite frequently happen that you're essentially on the outs with some king, you have to go in exile to some other realm, and you grouse around there maybe until that king dies, or maybe until your son has to, go back. And so at some point or other, they'll be restored. You're continuously, as a king, being petitioned to have by all these kind of exiles, to have them have their land restored. And so you can see that this is like essentially shown as being then, in the same way that Milton, in a more modern age, is essentially talking about things that appeal to his contemporaries. We'll have freedom. We won't have to be servants. This kind of arguments. These are arguments you can imagine where the Anglo-Saxons here, the Old Saxons both, would be able to see, okay, I kind of get where Satan and all his angels are coming from in terms of, because otherwise you might ask, well, why are they so, what do they got against us, us humans? We don't do anything. It was God that they had a war with and Michael. Why aren't they trying to do everything they can to go after Michael the Archangel and all these other guys? Well, they can't do anything about that. But now you can see why, there's a legitimate understanding about what the motivation here is, about why Satan and all these angels are constantly putting horrible obstacles or curses or other kinds of problems in your life. So just to wrap it up here in terms of what Satan is saying to all of his fallen angels, if any of you might achieve with cleverness, that they the word of God's law abandon, So if you can get it to them to be disobedient to God's law, they, the humans, will immediately become hateful to him, God. If they break his commandments, then he will become irritated with them. Their joys afterwards will transform and turn into a spear-sharp punishment, some hard harm's shearing. Think of this, all of you, how you might betray them. Afterwards, I might comfortably rest in these chains if mankind, that kingdom loses. So, we're going to be able to have some consolation down here, having lost it all, if we can at least make other people miserable with us. So. Yeah, misery loves company and envy. So, as neat as this is, what I find about this text is that as retold here in Old Saxon, Genesis becomes a story of a king, the all-wielder, to use his ornamental epithet, and his thanes, the most mighty of which is tempted to usurp the throne, banished from their inheritance in heavenland. Lucifer and his warband know they can't thwart God directly and therefore plot to subvert his plan to the people, God's plan to people heavenland with human souls or pure human souls. So in other words, if they get humans to be disobedient, they won't be able to do that. So, where we've come from, in the whole course of all this, we've come to a very different narrative and than what we had when we read, the Yahweh source, the original Genesis. So unlike the serpent, whose nature was simply said that is more crafty than all the wild animals that the Lord God created. So in other words, the nature was highlighted, but we didn't actually ever get any motives from the serpent. And indeed, as the story is told, what the serpent even says isn't necessarily even false. It's quite an ambiguous story and fable, whereas actually what ends up happening now in the next components of Old Saxon Genesis, which we don't have time to read through the whole poem, but essentially there's a lot of lying that goes on. So it is we've now established very clear motivation, a very strong plan within the worldview of Old Saxons and Anglo-Saxons, and then how then Satan and his minions are able to then use very overt deceptions in order to fulfill that plan. So this retelling then supplies Lucifer with motives that are very compelling indeed to the Old Saxon audience. And so what I'm going to suggest then is that our nuanced picture of Lucifer is built on Milton's and not the Bible's. So, go ahead.
And I think you said that this manuscript was in the possession of a friend and contemporary of Milton's.
Yes.
So he would probably have known it.
So, in fact, there's 2 slides that just got dropped out. So you've anticipated those. So this is the concluding slide, but there's a couple more little things that I want to bring up before that. Exactly like you say, to how do we get then from the Anglo-Saxon version of the Old Saxon Genesis? So how do we get from the Junius Manuscript to Milton? And so as I mentioned, Junius has the book. He is friends with Milton. There is a time period when they could have overlapped, but it's not very long. So they don't have too much time where Milton could have had to actually consult the book, but he does have some time that he could do it. It's also not entirely clear how good Milton was at reading Anglo-Saxon.
Well, he was a very good linguist.
He's a very good linguist. And the one thing that you would know is that, what I think can be pointed out is, you would also get this is an illustrated story. So your eye could also be drawn to it, and then you might want to find out what it's about. And so it's not like just being confronted with a bunch of text that you have to you don't know if it's worth your while to go through it, right? And so one of the things that was true, contemporarily to this event is that Milton had as his objective, as his plan, that he wanted to write the great English national epic, an epic poem. And he had in his mind, or his initial plan, that, well, he's probably going to do something from either English history or British history or legendary British history, people thought maybe, people used to think that King Arthur was much more real than we now understand. And so possibly writing an Arthurian legend. we're going to have a whole lecture on King Arthur at some point. Yeah, so people were complaining whether or not King Arthur is real. King Arthur is not a lot of people, there have been all kinds of different things where people do these hunts for the historical King Arthur and all this kind of thing. Whether or not there was some guy named Arthur, that may well be. But the actual source of the story is a 12th century, half Norman, half Welsh writer named Geoffrey of Monmouth. And he's the guy who created the Arthur legend. So in the exact same way that Aristotle said, no matter how, like even in the first generation after this happened, that ever since Plato wrote this story of Atlantis, that everybody has been looking around for Atlantis, and people to this day are still looking around for Atlantis. And Aristotle's like, if you want to know where Atlantis came from, look at Plato. Plato is where Plato wrote this. In that same exact way, what happened is that after Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote the history of the kings of Britain, it just became a European-wide bestseller, and everybody immediately took it as real and as an actual history. And so it became very, very popular. And within a couple generations, the kings of England were naming their sons Arthur. So they were Prince Arthurs, and only a couple random, deaths and things like that prevented us from having, it could be a King Arthur on this, the restaurant. Anyway, at a certain point, it didn't happen, and so now we're not likely to have Arthur become a royal king name anytime soon in the UK. But back then, they really thought that Arthur was quite real. But we can say with total surety that there is nothing related to the Arthur story, the story as we have it, relates to a historical figure. There may well have been people named Arthur. That's not relevant to whether the story has anything to do with them. So,
Who's the guy in the lower center?
So just one more connecting note. So just to wrap that portion of it up. So Milton was maybe going to retell the Arthur story. He hadn't precisely decided, but sometime around this time when he's talking to Junius, he completely switches course and makes the English national epic be a retelling of Genesis with this whole war in heaven component onto it. And so you can't prove it or whatever because it's not there's no literary dependence here. And Milton didn't write that he'd done this or anything about it, so we don't know. But it's a pretty compellingly interesting thing that this particular very interesting source may well have influenced Milton and thus influenced us in terms of all of our contemporary understanding of Lucifer and the devil.
Maybe like Hollywood's inspired by or based on.
Yes, that's what it would be inspired by, because it's not like a translation of, and as we even have seen, because we've read kind of extensively, it's nice when we can kind of do these deep drill downs because we can get really into the text. But as we saw with Milton's text, Milton is really giving contemporary motives to his character, which are quite different. He's not worrying about Thanes and and all the kinds of things that the author of the Old Saxon Genesis was concerned about, right? So, Rudy has a question. Oh yeah, we're going to start identifying if we can pick all these.
Because I heard Elizabeth asking who that man in the middle at the bottom is. That's George Burns.
This one, George Burns, right?
Yes.
So he's in a movie called "Oh God, You Devil,"
Yeah.
right?
He played God and he played the devil.
He played God and the devil. I put that one on as opposed to the devil and Max Devlin because I thought it's a little bit, I don't know, the fact that the Hollywood was picking God to be George Burns and a black guy, to be the devil was anyway problematic. But anyway, yeah, it's like South Park, the movie Legend, that the graphic novel by Neil Gaiman, Simpsons.
You don't have any female devils.
Yeah, I don't have the female devils. There are too. I should have. Elizabeth Hurley, yeah. So I'm missing some. I went through. Anyway, this is the one from that TV show I talked about.
I like the baby.
I like the baby too. It shows that we have to have a fairly nuanced view of this character, which is representing ultimate evil. If we can dress babies up for Halloween, right? I mean, we don't do. I don't know. There's a lot of characters that are. Maybe it just hasn't been long enough that we don't dress babies up as more contemporary evil figures, right?
Are women more evil or no?
Well, in this picture, it's men.
I've seen baby Trumps.
Yeah, I know. Well, that's true. But I guess it's because he's also can also be kind of a joke. So anyway, you don't see baby Hitlers. That's what I'm saying. So
Ray Walston and
Elizabeth, if you wanted to comment, you have to have the mic.
Ray Walston in Damn Yankees.
Ray Walston, damn Yankees.
Yeah, he was the devil.
Okay.
It was, the story about this fanatic fan of the cellar-dwelling Washington senators who sold his soul to the devil. This is a Broadway musical.
Yeah.
To become a brilliant ball player who was invincible. As the chorus says, "You'll hit a homer, Joe, we can depend on you." Why? Because he has diabolical powers.
Right.
And I think it was Ray Walston played Mr. Applegate, who was the devil, and he has a song called "Those Were the Good Old Days."
And it's like the it was reminding me of in The Man for All Seasons when the associate of Thomas More, his young associate Richard Rich, has testified against it, perjured himself against him in order to convict him, and he's wearing a chain of office. And Thomas More says, is that a chain of office? And he says, yes, I've been made solicitor for Wales. And Thomas More says, it profiteth a man nothing to sell his soul for the whole world, but for Wales. And the other one here that's like in that same genre is that in the Simpsons, Homer sells his soul for a donut. So it depends on the level of the people are willing to sell their souls for a lot different costs depending on what their own personal value is. So
How seriously they take this.
So all right, we can continue to have questions, but anyway, that's well. Thank you very, very much. We'll go ahead and close.